So this presentation is kind of the culmination of a series of presentations that I've been doing since last year, which started with a close reading on Heidegger and with an eye towards digital being. So this project revolves around two blended issues: the existence of world phenomena like digital and non-digital worlds, and how engaging with multiple world aesthetics affect the self. Therefore, the goal of the project is to develop an understanding about a digital, non-digital existence, which will shed some light on contemporary life. The reason I am drawn to this particular project, or quest as I like to call it, is best illustrated by the croakers who posit, as we find ourselves jettisoned from the electronic media into digital reality, we are not left without guides. This quote is important because it illustrates two important phenomenological realities. First, there are writers, thinkers, artists, and people in general that we can turn to help guide us through understanding our new reality. Furthermore, moving into the digital age is not a choice, rather it is forced upon those who engage with a digital world. This, for me, builds off Neil Postman and Heidegger. For Postman, a technological existence like the one found in a digital age is an existence where one is dominated by their technology, which he calls a technopoly. Looking to Heidegger, we see that technology has its own world that appears to be separate from others. That is, it has its own horizons one must actively cross to be within. Furthermore, worlds influence one's own consciousness, which means that a digital world as a technological world in its own right influences those who engage in it. Therefore, the fundamental question concerning this project is, what does it mean for a human existence that engages in both a digital and non-digital world? That is, I am seeking to understand what it means to be digital. I am seeking to develop a logos of method properly suited to understanding a blended or fused existence. To engage this question, I engage in a hermeneutic theory developing praxis that is supplemented by hermeneutic case studies. The case studies I don't really get into here, but in question time you can ask about them. This allows the theory to present itself beyond speech, meaning that theory can have some real world grounding. Hermeneutics for Heidegger and Gadamer follows the idea that one is navigating the horizons of communication. Any communicated reality can be navigated through hermeneutic praxis, which includes technological horizons like the horizons of a digital world. This project is split into four parts. One, problematizing methodology in a digital age, wherein I lay the foundations to a methodology better suited to understanding our contemporary digital, non-digital existence. Two, the question concerning the world in a digital age, where I focus on expanding on the idea of worlds as fused entities comprising the world as a boundless thing. Three, the self, in which I explore the significance of the self and its implications, and the implications of the self's desire to will itself as a bound existence within a boundless reality. Four, the digital condition, where I explore the self condition of a digital age and offer some concluding thoughts. The first section is necessary in order to consider reality as both split within its respective realms and as well as a single limitless entity, i.e. the digital non-digital is not split by a horizon in reality, rather this split only exists in speech, in the social and in our minds. Yet this anthropocentric reality is an actual reality that presses upon us. By exploring this truth, we can come to understand how to properly venture through this reality. Upon laying this foundation, we naturally raise the question concerning non-digital self-representation and self-performance, and the relation that exists between the digital and the non-digital. These issues are brought forward by engaging with Sherry Turkle, Donna, Haraway, and Astor Taylor. Focusing on Turkle, we noticed the dual aesthetic existence of existing in a digital and non-digital world. For her, we live a life of two aesthetics. A life where both aesthetics simultaneously exist and are always already in a state of interaction. For theorists such as Haraway, Karen Broad, Rebecca Sheldon, this dual existence is a product of an anthropocentric frame of mind. That is, when one considers the world, one is always considering the world with a specific semiotic mindset. For Haraway and Broad, a semiotic shift is necessary in order to overcome the semiotic problem. Through questioning anthropocentric methodology as a logos of method, we are immediately placed up against method as a problem of language and not method itself. The problem that comes to bear is the problem brought forward by Heidegger, Gadamer, and object-oriented ontologists, or OOO, critical thinkers like Rebecca Sheldon, that between the language representation of a thing and the thing itself, there exists a gap. For post-humanists and some queer feminist theorists, a semiotic shift, again, is necessary to overcome this gap. However, when considering language in and of itself, we realized that language, regardless of semiotic construction, is always referential. That is, when one communicates, they are always referring to something in itself and never communicating the thing in and of itself. This communication problem is not an issue that must be overcome, rather it is an issue that must be understood in order to truly understand the reality of existence. That there is always, at minimum, a simultaneous duality of existence, the thing and its representation, or how one relates to the thing to the object. Or in terms of the world, there is always the non-digital and some other, i.e. the digital. This idea of simultaneously existing within a digital and non-digital world raises the question concerning reality itself. For the Croakers, we see the existence of a digital reality when we realize that the simulation capacity of computers can now generate reality itself. Which leads to the question, how is it that the digital world can be understood to be as much of a part of the real world as you and I? This comes from the Gadamerian and Heideggerian idea that the world is a fusion of worldly horizons. For them, worlds come together, and from their coming together, they world the world. In simple terms, when one considers the world linguistically, they create the pedantic, anthropocentric language world in which they find themselves. Once some world has been worlded, they come up against the horizon of that world and interact with it, thereby affecting how they are. This idea that worlds affect each other is supported by the idea that engaging in digital media has an effect on physiology and our brains. That is, digital media has changed the neural connections and growth rate of our minds. In considering this reality, the digital world affects us in the non-digital world in ways that are not immediately evident. That any existence of one world and some other world that interacts, as supported by thinkers such as Astor Taylor, becomes obvious and becomes a misunderstanding. That the worlds do not exist in different realms, rather they are the same realm. That is, there is one boundless world wherein we anthropocentrize this world to have boundaries, and we furcate it through interpreting it. When one comes to the realization that the digital has an effect on our physiology, it puts forward the question, how does the furcation of the world into distinct worlds like a digital versus non-digital affect the existence of the self? When first considering the self, we can turn to theorists such as Nietzsche, Alan Bloom, and William James, who explain the self to be a creation of the mind. It was a product of our inability to reduce our metaphysical understanding with modern science to actually pinpoint the soul. From that came the idea of our conscious self. This then permeates itself online as a thing that can be represented digitally. That is, our data self is a digital representation of our non-digital self. However, since our self is a mere creation, any claim to a self is a nostalgia for something it never truly was, i.e., the self has a nostalgia for itself. When considering this with the reality of the anthropo-furcated world, we begin to see interesting problems concerning not only the existence of the self, but the existence of a digital self, which then lends to explain issues put forward by Walker Percy. For him, consciousness is always creating selves for situations, and then forgetting that self as though it was never actually part of the self. That from each worlding instance, we create selves. That is, the self selves just as the world worlds, or, like what Aristotle, thoughts thought. And in terms of William James, imagination imagines the unreal room next door as simultaneously real and unreal. From this we see that the digital self is just another furcation that is then set aside as not the self, or Walker Percy calls the amnesic self, which then competes with the self for self-recognition. That the self, as Turkle points out, is never a totalized entity, or in Heideggerian terms, the self-thing does not gather itself like other things. That the idea of a totalized self is a byproduct of a conceptual world of things. However, this conceptual world of things only adds to the existence of split selves, that with each conception of a self-conception, we only add to the impossibility of ever actually having a self-conception, and by extension, a self. It is, like Sherry Turkle, the totalized self-thing is a mere scientific psychological imagination. When considering a digital self that is not the self, we can see why selves are at times fine with the self being treated in peculiar ways. Consider Heidegger and the idea that the technological human stands in reserve. That is, our technological and economic existence has had a profound effect on people that cause them to be no different than a resource, thus creating the human resource. This notion is exacerbated online. The human resource as a body entity is also resourced as a digital self body. The digital self is bought and sold for advertisement and data gathering purposes. Digitization commodified the digital self into a data prostitute. This is not to say that prostitution is inherently bad, it's more to put forward what is actually occurring. That like the trafficked women Emma Goldman discusses in The Traffic in Women, one does not have the choice to be a data prostitute, they have been forced. Thus, a trafficked data prostitute, like the technopole who is jettisoned into the digital age, the digital self has been gathered into a state of being trafficked. The idea of the trafficked data prostitute lends itself to surveillance issues, that is, states and corporations can purchase these trafficked digital entities, meaning that states are complicit in the unwelcome trade of data selves, or for posthumanists, the data body. Since states were always already in a process of surveying their populations as data entities, we must consider the surveillance differences that exist within a digital world. It is a surveillance that begins primarily with data representation of the self as the self, though it can translate into the body, keeping in mind that the body can be digitized to the online through physical tracking, which lends to the posthumanist data body notion, that the body is just as digital as anything else. The data body, in this sense, begins to lose all privacy and matter. Like the dematerialization of matter through thingification, discussed by Judith Butler, the body is dematerialized through digitization. Following the notion of the bifurcated data self, the data body, we begin to understand the coming of, and what some call the digital tribe, or data communities, that are just as, if not more, influential than the so-called real communities. Consider Neil Postman and the idea that in an electronic era, we are more capable of communicating beyond our boundaries. Any one person elsewhere may be more similar than one's neighbor, which allows for the notion that we are more neighbor with someone on the other side of the physical world than you are with somebody sitting directly beside us. This allows the digital community to have more substance than any real community. This allows Turkle to put forward the notion being alone together, that we are alone, physically speaking, yet digitally we are together. This is to move us towards understanding what theorists such as David Terrace calls the digital tribe. That because we are more able to get our social needs from the digital, our digital belonging is more important and thus more impactful. Furthermore, since the digital and the non-digital are not actually separate existences, they transcend beyond themselves into the others, and in this case, the digital community transcends itself beyond the digital and into the digital, allowing for digital action to have massive implications in the non-digital world. In conclusion, when considering the contemporary world, there can be no methodological conception bereft of holistic existence. That when considering how things are, the digital cannot be ignored, nor can the non-digital, or language and culture. The world is not a bifurcated, disjoint collection of separate existences, rather it is a complete and total whole that only appears to be bifurcated and reducible because we either desire it to be, or, like the will to power, we force it through our anthropocentric ideals. To end off, I'd like to, and end is not necessarily a poem, but I think it's poetic. I wrote it, so I'll just read it. My being is not defined by some place or space. My soul has never been, nor will it ever be. Myself is not some corporeal thing that has some real essence. My body is not some defining aesthetic of my being. My conscience does not apprehend my existence. I am not something that must be identified as real, for I am simply me. Thank you.
But later you said the body is just as digital as anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that this has been, to give you a proposed literal answer about what does it mean to be digital, in essence it means to be in a binary. This has been a problem for a lot of queer theorists, because how do you reconcile this fact that, this digital world is increasingly binary, and beyond just the sort of semantic play between binary gender and binary ones and zeros, as you said, there obviously are real physiological implications of digital bodies. And I just wanted to know how you would respond to that, or how you would sort of work with that, that challenge.
So I would never reject the distinction that being digital is, in the first instance, always binary. But I have issues with that when you consider the ways in which you can represent yourself online and the plethora of points where you can express your existence online.
Right, you can mediate yourself, sorry.
You can mediate yourself, there are many different apps or locations, places, spaces, whatever you want to call something like Facebook or Twitter or anything, and each one of those instances can actually be different. And so you're not necessarily, I don't think one is necessarily binary in that it's technically infinite, the amount of frications you could have online, like in life. Every time you self-express, you're not necessarily always expressing yourself, and then that becomes you from that moment forward. That self can change and the old self can be forgotten, right? And as you keep moving on, and I think that translates into the digital. Each self doesn't have to interact on the digital, and we can curate that and change it over time, right? So it's always changing, and I don't think it's necessarily binary. Well, it can be binary if you forced it to be, but I don't think it's always binary, because there's also not necessarily one putting themselves, like performing themselves. There is also the structure that they perform themselves into that also negates them from being exactly what they are. Because in some ways, while the digital appears to be more limitless than real world, it's limited in the way that it's programmed. It only allows you to be so much. And also the people acting within it. So there's Mika Cardenas, when she was transferring from a male to a woman, she lived in Second Life for 365 hours as a dragon, yet she was denied the ability to do things in this supposed limitless space. When she went to a virtual bar, because she was a dragon, she wasn't allowed to pole dance, and she wasn't allowed to interact with certain patrons of the bar, and so she was kicked out of the bar. And so there are things, they kind of translate back and forth, and so while you may be binary, or even more than binary, there are certain aspects that are going to try and deny that. And so it's all, for me, just one. And then the way we interact in this one, we are able to fricate it to how we either desire or to how some other, those with power perhaps, try to will us to be. And so there's this acceptance of it, I think, but also there should be a rejection of it in order to be, if that makes sense.
Rejection of the binary, or sorry, rejection of what?
The rejection of probably the will to power. Not the idea of the will to power, but those who will power.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know if that makes any sense. Made sense to me. Yeah.
So it seems like a lot of this is a very preferential view of digital selves and involving digital representations, which in a lot of representations, this is not necessarily my area of focus or study, but seem to be presented rather well. But I was wondering how you would engage with the concept of deep fakes, particularly in relation to those in positions of power. And I think particularly I would conceive of this in relation to rather recently the president of Gabon, who was, we don't necessarily know the truth of the matter, but a lot of the Gabonese believe that the government put out a deep fake presentation of him at New Year's, I think it was in 2017, saying that he was still alive, when we don't necessarily know if he's still alive yet or not, and the government had conducted this in order to preserve this digital identity, like presenting it to the public to say that he was still alive and well and functioning, when we don't necessarily have proof of whether or not he is actually well or not. And there's like a whole history behind it as well. But with that, it seems that the presentation of deep fakes, whether or not seeing that they are becoming more of a concern, particularly for both very highly publicized figures, whether they be in like celebrities or social media or whatnot, or in this instance, particular political figures, and the representation of the self in that way when it is not actually in control of the individual who is being represented, and the perception of self in that way, and the power like relations that portrays down to. Because I know in my area of study that is something that is like deeply concerning in terms of how the concept of truth, or the relation of who is able to convey truth on behalf of an individual, that is like a very prevalent issue that we don't have an answer to yet. So I wonder how you would respond to it.
Yeah. Deepfakes are obviously very concerning. It's a way, for me, the way I understand it, like the deepfake is a way to world an inauthentic reality and present it as authentic. One of the ways, I actually kind of work through this in the actual paper itself, but I make a call to Kafka's Metamorphosis. So in the Metamorphosis, Gregor is stuck in his room as an insect and he can't get out, and the doors are locked, so nobody knows what's going on. But then the office clerk comes and tells them that Gregor is not a good salesman, he sucks at his job, and he's always late. But we know, as the readers, that that's not true. Gregor is an adequate salesman, he's never late, and he's always on the road. And so it's a kind of like a deepfake. They're inventing the world, and those who have no power can't kind of stop that. But you don't necessarily need power, because the office clerk is just an office clerk. They don't necessarily have power. But they're the ones you kind of look to create the world. And so if we give weight to social media, that it is capable of presenting the world, it exists in real time, one might say, then these deep fakes can become real. They're kind of like an inauthentic, authentic reality. They're legitimized. And so that kind of plays into this thing that there has to be some sort of rejection of it. We can't just take things for face value. A lot of ways, the idea of like deep fakes and Donald Trump and the way they go about presenting the world digitally, for me, isn't necessarily different than the issue of the sophists in the long, long time ago, right? And then the way that they're trying to abuse language to kind of make things in their own way.
Right.
And then so it's a similar issue that's being played out over and over, time and time again throughout history. But we have a different way of doing it that's slightly more powerful.
Being very different, because it is one thing to fabricate a truth and say that it is one thing when it's not. Because in that way, in a space without deepfake, there is tangible way to prove that you're always on time and that you're always on the road. Like there is evidence to relay that fact.
Yeah.
Versus something happening where someone is dead and they have a video presented of them saying that they're still alive.
But this also isn't new. Like it's been done before in print media before there ever was televised.
But not to the same degree to this stuff is now.
But it's only because of the amount we have. So if you take in like conceptions like speed theory, right, and the faster technology gets, we can't keep up with it. And so the only reason, or not the only reason, one of the reasons why it appears as more prevalent now is because we have more access to it and it's harder to keep up with it. So it's just faster than before. Before, when it first started happening with say print media, it was just as fast to them then. But to us now, that print media is slow. And now digital media is fast. And so it's just new instances of technology just being faster creates a new perception of reality. And this kind of goes into the issue of worlding, that through language we world the world, or through any kind of way of revealing. And so technology as an actionable thing reveals, and through our performances of like an action of the performance creates reality in some sense of it. And so the deep fake is trying to do the same thing for some benefit of some other. And I think that's kind of how it is. And then what one would do with that is attempt to refuse it, attempt to try and find, is it true, is it fake, how can we do this? And then that's why a lot of people are trying to make software to try and dissect this, because you can't just dissect a lot of deep fakes purely by talking it out or by watching it. It requires more. And so you need a similar technology, right? With print media, it'd be print media against print media. With deep fakes, it requires ones and zeros coding to get over it. And so we just have to catch up. But then eventually some new technology like quantum computing will come out, and then it'll be the same thing over again. There'll be another way to make deep fakes that we'll be dealing with once again, I think.
Would that not suggest at some point like a rejection of a full digital self in terms of presentation? Because in the same way that when we see journalism presented in print media, by and large, not wholeheartedly, but I would argue that that is perceived as more trustworthy because it is gone through a rigorous process, but for the most part when it comes to things like newspapers and journal articles, as opposed to opinion articles or position pieces that are written on blogs, where the presentation of media and the access and the speed to which they can be presented is so different that allows for those that take longer time to, in this case, or the older ones in this instance, journal written articles being viewed as more authentic or more trustworthy, as opposed to online news media where almost anybody can turn themselves into like a news website if they so choose. So wouldn't that suggest that if we are always one step behind in terms of our capacity to keep up with the speed of which technology is advancing, that there should be a certain element of rejection of the digital selves to the fullest capacity without any kind of means of authenticating what has been presented?
I think we're saying the same thing, just
Okay.
in different terms, in the truth of it.
Okay.
So I have a short question, maybe. You talked about the digital self, and you mentioned the authentic self. So how would you define the authentic self in your terms? I mean, what do you refer to when you mention the authentic self?
I don't think I said authentic self. I said there's a potential, we present things as authentic, as though they truly exist beyond language or something, that we've legitimized it in some sense. And I don't think the self is authentic. It's invented, it's imagined, and it has purpose, that we can give it meaning and we can build worlds around it or build ourselves around some sort of idea of self. But the self itself is not inherent in the world. We will it into existence. It was not there a priori. If that makes sense. Emil?
Thanks for your talk. You just said something very revealing and interesting. Beyond language or something.
Yeah.
What's that or something?
Or something, just be some other way of presenting reality. So through other technological means. So language, the way I understand it, is just a technology, no different than any other tool. So some other might be the computer, digital, so Facebook or something, or ways that you can potentially represent authentic things. We give a lot of weight to the realities that you see in computers and on television, but these things themselves are not necessarily reality or authentic in any stretch of the means. They're willed potentially differently, but not inherently differently. There's some difference, but it's still much the same, I think.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the conversation we had recently about semiotics and
Yeah.
because currently there's a sort of tendency to conflate language with media. And so in a sense, media studies have replaced the language problem of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And so I'm just trying to think how you might think about semiotics through that or something.
Well, the or something I think would be, because it would have a different semiotic construction, but not everyone was there for our conversation, but anyways, human semiotics tends to have flexibility. Not tends, it does. I don't know, maybe somebody would disagree that it's not flexible. I think it's flexible. And I know others in the room think it's flexible as well. But even media and digital still has some sort of flexibility as well. You can reprogram stuff. You can edit TV shows later. It's done all the time. You can edit TV shows for different areas. For instance, if we're just going to use one media platform as an example, so you could, in Canada, they might put ginger ale, and in the US, they might not. They might put Pepsi or something. And so you can see the flexibility even in our digital worlds that we try and create. So the semiotics is similar in its flexibility, in presentation, not necessarily. I think, if that makes sense.
So point of clarification, are you putting semiotics and digital communication in two different, or are you saying that digital communication has its own semiotics?
It can, right? So it depends on how you're doing it and what you're doing. And then for the most part, it probably does, but if you're sending an email, it's still the same language, it's just it's written. But a lot of times, I think conversational English probably has more flexibility than written English for the most part, but it's still very flexible. And so while at a lot of times it may appear to be a different semiotic construction because it exists under a different system, sometimes it still is the same, but for the most part, it's not. It depends on how you're doing it. If you are using art, that's not the same semiotic representation of something as speaking about it. Like they say, art, a picture is 1,000 words. It is not literally 1,000 words. It's a completely different semiotic representation of reality. But art is also very flexible, especially in terms of interpretation, which is another issue with English or any language. Interpretation becomes an issue. And art and any other media or digital is not free of interpretation problems. Even if you know a lot about coding, even coding isn't free of interpretation. When you're coding, while you can say this is what I think this particular function does, some other might come and read it and actually misinterpret it and think it does something else, and then write a program, and they'll still work together to a specific end. But if somebody written a different program, they work together, it would have come to a completely different end. And so even coding has, even though it's much more stringent, there's still flexibility even in coding. I say as a coder. I have no apps out there, but yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to try and stumble my way through a lot of thoughts on your presentation, which are in some ways in line with some questions from Julie and Rachel as well about how we think bodies in relation to this collapse into singularity of the digital and non-digital, in terms of having a real kind of concrete effect on those things. And so I'm wondering if there's a danger that this digital, non-digital difference becomes kind of re-inscribed as the difference between real and non-real, authentic and inauthentic. And if I was going to switch to a kind of register when I want to talk about control societies, say then, if my identity is inauthenticated when I'm trying to pass through a certain point, then I will be subject to violence, not to be allowed passage. The free flow of information entails the obstruction of certain bodies and their right to pass into different kind of controlled areas. So I'm wondering if there is this kind of underside to this convergence of the digital and the non-digital that encodes inauthenticity as a kind of perverse symptom of the real. So for example, like Sidewalk Labs, a Google asset, has just bought up a huge chunk of Toronto waterfront, and they're going to be developing a massive private smart city. And what you mentioned in your presentation, which I really liked, is this idea of the resourcing of digital self-bodies, or data prostitution, you calls it. But the strange thing is, like, that's not where the real exploitation is happening. It's more in my failure to make myself a data prostitute living in the smart city. That's where I am really subjected to exclusion. I cannot access, taxi cab services if I don't have a Google wallet, if I don't have a 5-star social credit rating, what have you. So I'm just wondering how you conceive of the difference between the binaries of authentic and inauthentic, real and unreal, and how that kind of fits into this hermeneutic circle of a digital and non-digital that you're setting up and trying to problematize and converge.
Yeah, I'm trying in a lot of ways break down that binary, like digital versus the non-digital. In the writing, it starts off with like a slash, and then I put a dash to say that boundary doesn't exist. We invent that boundary like we do with anything else. But I don't. And I'm not trying to say anything about it, but I'm starting from the way we understand the world, the way we perceive it as the first instance of the problem, and then the data prostitution is just like a really bad ending. That's kind of, if you don't understand a problem, if we don't deal with any issues that exist, this is where we've come to. And the Google issue is just another issue like that, right? Which actually goes more into kind of in a way supporting the idea that there is no divide, like the Google issue there, but also you look to China and the social credit system that they've implemented, right? They're literally bringing the digital into the real. You can look at them like augmented reality, right? Another way of bringing the real into digital into the real, that boundary is crossable. And what we do with that crossability is where we end up having issues, right? So either we just accept that they are crossable, they don't exist, and then we can deal with it that way. But if we have this continuation of trying to say that they are separate, that worlds are separable, and that we exist in one world at one point, or we are one self at one point, and I'm not my digital self because it's just me performing something. I'm making a joke or some gambit. But if there's also this acceptance that you can do things that have tangible effect online, then it's going to affect the real world. And so there has to be an acceptance that they are the same. And once there's a realization that there is no boundary, then we can hopefully, potentially, maybe, who knows, most likely not, overcome a lot of these issues. But a lot of that stems before even going online, right? It was already an issue, and then online just made it faster and harder to get after. And then due to, I don't want to say a blindness, but kind of a blindness, it's been allowed to happen. And not only now, a lot of people are starting to realize it, and a lot of people ignore it. Like, I read a lot of comment sections on news articles like this, and they just say, well, this is just the way the world is, and we have to get used to it. And I reject that. I don't think we have to get used to it. And it's not the way the world is, it's the way we've allowed it to be, and it's the way we've allowed the power to will it to be. And you have to be a rejection or a refusal, kind of like politics of refusal as recognition. I think there's a lot of ways that you have to refuse it, because if you don't, then these issues just keep happening. So I think we agree.
Yeah, I
just
see
in
what you're
different
saying.
terms. Yeah.
For sure. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions? And
Okay, I am thinking through this, and yeah, I agree that there's a connection between the digital and non-digital self. And I'm also thinking that from the perspective of performance online and interpretation of your performance by others, isn't there a case to be made about how your performance, your different performance across platforms, the different interpretations of your performance there will create different non-digital selves?
Yeah, it kind of builds into, I think, I kind of touched that in the presentation, or maybe one of the questions, but yeah, every time you act as a self, you've, in a sense, created a new self. It's kind of like the immediacy, or the, like Heidegger uses the occasion. Like, every time you look at the occasion of the world, in hindsight, you've created a new world, kind of thing, right? And so it's just that, but online. So every time you do something online, in one instance, is a representation of yourself, right? Like, your Instagram self is not your Facebook self or your Twitter self, right? But then it also comes into issues that if being online can self, right, you can perform yourself and make it real online, then it just becomes a question. A lot of people like to joke about it, but there's some truth to it. Like, if you're not online, are you real? If there are no pics, did it happen, right?
I don't have like a very good question, but just something that keeps coming up in my brain, in my mind. I haven't wrestled with this topic at all, really, but maybe in terms of, because you're trying to argue that there's not really a difference between the digital self and the so-called authentic self, or some concept of authentic self. But how would you work death into that? I mean, the relationship, I mean, as a mortal being, I want you to die at some point, so that definitely figures into like selfhood. I haven't.
That's actually an issue that you can consider today has become a real issue. Twitter is no longer getting rid of accounts after people have died.
Yeah.
And so now there's this issue of people can, if the self online is truly a self, then the self exists past the actual self. Assuming the self actually exists. There's also, so I'm sure people watch Black Mirror. There's that one episode where they create the woman's husband, I think it is.
Oh, right. Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Out of all of his digital footprint. And then it comes a question, is that actually that person? And I would say just no, it's not. And I don't think we should be memorializing these things as real and letting them live past. But then it also becomes a question, is it any different than keeping like diaries or like books or anything like that around? Because some people have access to living beyond life that others don't, and they always have, like Plato and his writings, or famous people when we keep their books or whatever, books and diaries. And so is it fair to say that any non-worthy person, we'll call them, for not any reason at all, deny them the ability to live past? But I think that, but it still has to be a choice. You can't force people to live past themselves. Some people want, once they die, they want to end. But some people fear death, and so they strive to live past. And so I know some people who want their Facebook, it's written in their will.
Right.
I don't know if Facebook can do that, but it's kind of written in their will that they want to live past. And I don't think if you want like a fair, equitable world, I don't know how you would have to, someone, not me, would have to kind of grapple with that. It's kind of outside what I'm doing at the moment. Maybe in the future I would touch on that, but at this instant moment, it's, yeah.
But then that brings up the issue of like, what are the boundaries of the self? Because I would not consider my journals that are going to be left behind for people to find and read and be subjected to. I don't consider that really a self. So then are these digital relics, like, you know, remainders, would that, like that, and you just said yourself, you don't think that if you recreate a person out of that, that would be that person. So therefore, these are not ourselves.
It's a self. It may not be the self or the self that was that self, but it's still some instant or occasion of some self that was a self. Sorry, I said self a lot.
Right, yeah.
But I think that kind of makes sense. That
Like my wardrobe.
yeah,
My
it's
wardrobe
not
that I leave
you
behind is that.
now or you immediately prior to death, but that was some representation of you at some point. And so that all depends on how much weight people give it. And it's why a lot of people are afraid of their digital footprint, stuff they've said in the past. Are people going to interpret them as that them now or them when they were young and dumb? Curate your Facebooks, everybody. I have. Facebook thinks I have no interest. I've deleted them all. That's the end of that.
That's activism in the digital age, I
Yeah.
guess. Yeah. If there are no other questions, we'll probably wrap up and take a brief intermission. Thank you so much to Michael. That was great.